Hi, everyone. We are so delighted to be here with you today to share a sneak peek of our Truth About Sustainability research. My name is Laura. I'm the Chief Intelligence Officer at McCann World Group, and I'm also President of Truth Central.
And my name is Nadia, and I'm Senior Vice President and Global Director of Truth Central. So before we get started, we thought it might be fun just to kick things off with a surprise quiz. I'm going to say a term about sustainability, and then I'd like you to try to explain it back to me as if I were someone who knew absolutely nothing about it. Are you ready? Okay, just play along wherever you're sitting. Here we go. UNFCCC, COP, UNSDG, INDC. How about ppm? CO2? Okay. Here's an easy one for you. Anthropogenic. No? How about biogeochemical cycle? Hydrochlorofluorocarbons? Okay, one more. Maybe try your luck. Thermohaline circulation. Well, you would certainly be forgiven if you didn't know even one of these terms, or any for that matter. But it's this technical, scientific language that tends to be the way in which we talk about this issue, right? We talk about emissions and targets and temperatures, carbon, pledges, commitments. We've all heard about them, perhaps even within our own organizations, and certainly in the media and the public discourse. And it's for good reason. Sustainability and climate change are the central issue of our time. In our own research, we actually found that 82% of people globally believe that climate change is the biggest challenge facing the world in the next 20 years. And it's actually on par with the threat of a growing number of pandemics. And the truth is that sustainability used to be a niche, bureaucratic, somewhat governmental policy issue. I don't know if anyone in the audience here is old enough to remember President Jimmy Carter asking Americans to pull on an extra sweater to conserve energy in their homes. But if you fast forward today and in forums like this, it's fair to say that sustainability is everywhere, from the way in which we engage with social media, to the headlines that we read, to the ways in which we make decisions and decide which brands to buy. But it's also clear that we are so far from where we need to be in terms of making significant change. Somehow, this absolutely ubiquitous subject just isn't connecting, and we haven't made the progress that most experts deem necessary. So what's going on? And the truth is we talk endlessly about saving the environment or protecting the planet or lowering emissions. But what if we're talking about sustainability the wrong way? What if this discourse is actually hindering real progress? Now, when we ask people, everyday people in our global research, to identify the number one definition they associate with sustainability, perhaps it's no surprise that the answer is protecting the planet. But that isn't the whole story. We needed to dig deeper. So we asked people to take a step back and describe their own personal relationship with sustainability. And that's where we discovered a very, very different story. We received hundreds of photos from our qualitative exercise that showed pieces of daily life, daily lived experiences, from the food that people eat or even grow in their own gardens, their homes and the pride they take in maintaining them, the individual actions that they take to live more sustainably. And most strikingly, they shared with us their loved ones and themselves, photos of their kids and their families, future generations looking at them right in the eye. And they use specific language like pain and shock and love, the language of emotion and humanity shining through. So if we look at the ways in which the media and government and businesses talk about sustainability, and we contrast that with the ways in which everyday people talk about it, it's clear that something isn't quite right here. While science and data is absolutely essential and indisputable in this context, we're simply not creating the deep connection we need to drive change. And that's because we're talking about sustainability the wrong way. The truth is that sustainability isn't something separate from us. It isn't just the planet or the environment. It is us. And over the last several hundred years, the natural world has become othered from humans. So in short, the climate has eclipsed the people that it profoundly affects.
It's clear then, excuse me, I think I've been talking too much on Teams over the last 24 hours. But it's clear that we need to harness a massive shift in how we approach this complex topic, from the climate eclipse to deeply human stories. We desperately need to humanize this topic. We need to understand how it affects us daily. And one of the first steps in humanizing any topic is to understand that all humans are different and their attitudes and approaches towards sustainability will be heavily influenced by who they are, what life stage they are in, and whereabouts they live in the world. And once we start to look through this human lens, we start to uncover some really interesting nuances. For example, 70% of parents say that they are concerned about climate change versus 61% of non-parents. In fact, it's their passion and vision for future generations that could drive massive change. And while we all think of Gen Z as an activist generation, our findings reveal that people aged 55 to 64 are actually more likely to say that they are concerned about climate change than those aged 18 to 24. In many ways, Greta has become a catch-all for the idea that young people care about the environment. But brands are perhaps missing a trick when it comes to nurturing connections between generations. And here's the really crucial bit. The responsibility does not just lie on the shoulders of the people who buy brands. Because when we ask people who is responsible for reversing climate change, the answer is clear. It's actually a three-legged stool of shared responsibility between individuals, brands, and governments. And we've identified 5 shifts that can begin to chart a solution to make meaningful change in the world. We know that every single business is at a very different point on the spectrum, with some appointing chief sustainability officers and others just beginning on their journey. However, each one of these shifts can be harnessed to reveal more ways that are good for business and good for people and the planet that we need to protect. So from the climate eclipse to human stories, that's our first macro shift. But within that, we'd like to explore 4 more shifts that will help us to chart a pathway forward.
Okay, from changing culture to enriching culture. So as researchers, we've been decoding humans and culture for more than 10 years now, and we know that cultural context matters. Unfortunately, marketing messages and initiatives can fall flat if they're a one-size-fits-all approach to solving sustainability. In fact, language and cultural context matter, and there's really a major opportunity to be nuanced in order to motivate real action the world over. And sometimes it's just as simple as asking people, everyday people. So that's what we did. We asked people all over the world how they feel about climate change, and the results were fascinating. So in an attitudinal segmentation, we uncovered 5 very distinct groups. So on the one end, we have our worrying witnesses, which is about 39% of the global population. And these people say that they worry about climate change, but they feel powerless to stop it. Next, we have anxious activists, who are about 1/3 of the global population, and they say, I constantly worry about climate change. Next, we have what we call our headline hand-wringers, about 12% of the population, who say, I only worry about climate change when a disaster occurs. We have our distracted denizens, about 11%, saying, I just don't worry about climate change. And then lastly, we have what we're calling the reality refuters, about 7% of the global population, who say, I just don't believe climate change is real. Now, if you take all of this together, how do we then translate these attitudes into action? In other words, how can we enrich cultures to spark change? Well, the truth is that by taking all of this, we actually see that people are changing their behavior, and they're doing it on a global scale. People are doing so much, like reducing their waste and changing their diets and researching this issue. We found in our data that there's actually evidence that people all over the world are prepared to change their behavior, whether that's reducing the amount that they fly internationally, to giving up using plastic, to choosing to commute by bicycle. Now, if we just twist our lens a little bit and look at all of this macro data through the lens of culture, a lot starts to make sense. So, for example, in India, where people can be vegetarian due to religious and spiritual practices, respondents there are most likely to say that they're willing to give up eating meat to fight climate change. If you move over to Germany, which is a hotbed of engineering and good design, people there are most likely to say that they would buy products that are designed to last a long time in order to fight climate change. So ultimately, taking all of this together, if we want to spark change, it's actually about meeting people where they are culturally, starting with that low-hanging fruit that already exists, and then snowballing from there to more and more behavior change. It's this first step that can then lead to more and more sustainability on a grand scale. Take, for example, Brazil, Sao Paulo. The city has a rich history of street recycling. There's even a word for it. It's called catadores. Further, for those of you who are from there or have been lucky enough to visit and see all the magnificent street art, you'll know that street artistry is a deeply held tradition as well. So by leaning into both of these aspects, the street recycling and the street art, an artist named Mundano harnessed that energy and turbocharged it across the city by launching Kataki, an app that matches local waste collectors with individuals who need waste collected and recycled. The cultural twist is that street artists turn the recycling collection bins into works of local art. Now, as Mundano himself said about this project, Katagi's strength lies in its human aspect, and we couldn't agree more. The truth is that behavior change begins with a deep understanding of cultural context. So in summary, if we want to move from changing culture to enriching culture, it's about meeting people where they already are. And as we saw in the Kataki example, it's also about making that process enjoyable and engaging, which leads us to our next shift.
Okay, so I'd like to talk about moving from less stuff to more living. Now, as much as we've talked about cultural context and nuance is critical to achieving sustainability goals, there was one theme uncovered in our research that seems to transcend culture, and that theme is shame. Specifically, the shame that people all over the world feel when they think about failing in their sustainability actions. We see it time and time again, the guilt that individuals feel about their habits in a world that is not set up to encourage sustainable behaviors. So one example would be the woman in Japan who says that she feels guilty about buying plastic bags at the supermarket, or the man in the UK who feels guilty about driving a diesel car, or the man in Canada who admits that he doesn't actually know what to put in the recycling bin. The problem with all of this shame and this guilt is that it makes people feel bad about sustainability rather than good. And actually this leads to greater inaction and paralysis. Why bother contributing if ultimately I'm going to fail? Society really only conspires against us in this fight. One need only look at the headlines to understand how much sustainability is currently framed as an exercise in deprivation and sacrifice. Given this, it's fair to say that sustainability has something of a communications problem. It's a really tough sell for sure. I need to give up something for a future that I can't yet see. And while for some people this problem is affecting their day-to-day lives on a profound level already, there are still many people for whom this problem seems nebulous. But what if we could shift the conversation from being about less and more about more? Solving this critical issue actually gives us more of the good stuff and less of the bad stuff. So think about it. Less pollution means more health. Less processed food in schools means more learning and focus for children. Less planned obsolescence means more pride in ownership of the goods in our lives. All of these examples elevate human flourishing while reducing our impact on the earth. We're starting to see brands and businesses move towards a conversation about abundance rather than sacrifice when it comes to sustainability. It can be joyful, elevated, and beautiful. If we take IKEA as an example, this was a brand that was once synonymous only with throwaway furniture. It's now doing good on its commitments to becoming fully circular by 2030, and in doing so, opened its first second-hand store in Sweden. This is a delightful, beautifully designed store, aspirational in every way, to recast what second-hand furniture can look like in our lives. We think when framing sustainability efforts, we should be trying to answer a very important question. How is this going to make my life better today? This question can act as a lightning rod to coming up with beautiful solutions that are at once sustainable and indulgent. So in summary, we want to move from less stuff to more living. One way to answer this question is by honing our efforts on making the default the most sustainable option, which leads us to our next shift.
From hard decisions to easy defaults. So remember at the start of this talk when we said that respondents believe that the share of the responsibility for reversing climate change rests across individuals, governments, and businesses. So it begs the question, if everyone is responsible, why are companies putting people in the position to choose? The truth is that in many cases, we're putting everyday people in the position of making incredibly complex calculations in their heads on what products to buy and which brands to align with certain values, placing undue pressure on the individual part of this equation. Is it free range? Is it organic, fair trade, female founded, Black and brown owned, eco, ethical, conscious, local, artisanal, sustainably sourced, carbon neutral, energy efficient, renewable, biodegradable? The list goes on and on and on. So it's no wonder people want to throw their hands up and get the cheapest, easiest, most unsustainable options. Ethics be damned. The antidote to this sense of overwhelming mental calculus is what we're calling Ecoaccidentalism. This is the simple, elegant idea that the most sustainable choice is the default. And by the way, thinking about our last shift, it's also the most desirable. So let's consider the French. Yes, those envy-inducing examples of good living and indulgence. Their way of life hasn't happened by accident. The government has created the conditions for the most sustainable option to be systematically implemented, leading to lower impact and by extension, better living. For example, the government is moving to ban flights that are less than a couple of hours long, reducing emissions, yes, but liberating people from the stress and time of airport travel to enjoy a more scenic journey by train. The mayor of Paris has also mandated the creation of over 600 kilometers of bike paths in the city following the pandemic lockdowns, which reduces car exhaust and gas and creates healthy, enjoyable alternatives to bask in the City of Light's beauty. So let's take the inspiration from the French, who have been innovating to keep life enjoyable for hundreds of years. We really need to move from hard decisions to easy defaults and making that default the most sustainable and desirable option, because in the end, it's critical to business. Now, if all of this sounds like a tall order that would require significant innovation and investment, the good news is that by putting creativity at the heart of our organizations, change and innovation actually become easier. That's why our next and last shift is
from creative messaging to creative business. So we've talked to a lot of experts during the journey of this global research. Time and time again, the conversations reveal that in order to address this crisis, we can't simply tweak around the edges. We need to fundamentally rethink the ways that we live and do business. This absolutely requires scientists and engineers and climatologists, but we also need dreamers to drive change. Charles Duhigg, the New York Times reporter who has written extensively on behavior change and productivity, said it very well. Oftentimes, we look at a system and take an engineering approach, and we say, if we engineer out all of the problems, we're going to make more money and increase productivity. But the engineers always get triumphed by the dreamers who come along and say, you know what? Instead of just re-engineering this place, let's figure out what a brand new business would look like. Perhaps that's why there's so much faith in the power of brands. We are dreamers and the creatives who look at problems in new ways. In fact, our research reveals that 77% of people globally believe that brands have a greater ability to make positive change than the government does. That is incredible power. And while the government must work quickly to fundamentally address these critical issues, this reveals that brands have an equally potent role to play. As the activist Mary Annaïs Hegler says, the thing about climate change is that you can either be overwhelmed by the complexity of the problem or fall in love with the creativity of the solutions. The creativity, and it's that creativity that could ultimately save the world. And crucially, this same creativity, it can't be a competition. No one will win at sustainability. It's the creativity that builds exponentially the more companies, sectors, countries, and entities collaborate to fall in love with the creative solutions. If we take MasterCard as an example, the company recently announced a global sustainability innovation lab, which exemplifies the spirit of collaboration towards finding creative solutions. It unites everyone, businesses and individuals alike, in climate action. Or take the example of Allbirds and Adidas, competitors in the same category, who joined forces to experiment and build a shoe with lower carbon footprint, and it worked. The result was a shoe that is 63% lower than Adidas's most sustainable shoe prior to the partnership. All of this is to say sustainability shouldn't be political. It shouldn't be labeled as green or a CSR initiative. We must move from creative messaging to creative business. The truth is that being sustainable is simply good business, and it should be built into the core of everything the business does, from how products are made to the ways in which employees are harnessed as activists, to how messaging educates customers. We believe that a strong center of gravity, the core meaningful role for a brand, can guide these efforts. Because shouldn't we live in a world where all brands are sustainable brands? I think that brings us to the end of our presentation. And I believe we have a few minutes for questions. Okay, so I'm seeing a question that's just come up here, which is, excuse me, how much do you feel your research insights influence your company strategies, and have you got future studies or research planned? So we're actually about to officially launch this research as part of what we're calling a Well World initiative. And we're actually looking at this research in tandem with another study that we've done called The Truth About Wellness. And we're looking at sustainability and wellness as two sides of the same coin. And we actually had an amazing stat from the Truth About Wellness research that said, I think it was 87% of people think that creating a well world is the single biggest challenge for brands and businesses in the 21st century. So we think this is incredibly important, which is why we're having this launch event. We're going to have panels, and we're going to be inviting our clients to participate in that session with us, because we think it's really central to what we do as an organization. We need to be co-creating with all of our clients to contribute towards creating a well world. Do you have anything to add to that, Nadia?
No, I think you said it perfectly. We often work with teams with all of our major clients to make sure that all of our research is the fuel for strategic conversations and activation. So it's a great question. I see another question here, which is, which country has surprised you the most in relation to their culture around climate change? And I think this is such a great question, because this is essentially our bread and butter is, to understand universal human truths that sort of unite everyone all over the world, but then are expressed differently depending on where you are and what culture you live in, because cultural context obviously is key. And it's not so much that we were surprised by some of the findings, but more that it was so clear that it's so important to put these sort of scientific models in the context of culture and to understand the human perspective. That map that we showed you that showed what everyone was sort of prepared to do to fight climate change, almost play into like cultural tropes, which we think is so interesting. So like the example from India, where people are most likely than any other country to say that they're willing to be vegetarian. But also, and I can say this because I'm an American, the over-index in America was that people were most likely to say they were willing to give up international travel to fight climate change. And I think Americans sometimes, I think there's a stat that only a quarter of us have passports because we tend to stay within our own borders. And so I think it's understanding those contexts and understanding how societies are shaped that can then help us better tailor activation strategies depending on which market we're operating in. So it looks like that was it for our questions.
I think we've probably come to the end of our time. So thank you so much for joining us today, everyone. I hope that was interesting and you found the research useful. Apologies again for my voice. Like I say, I think I've just been talking too much on Teams over the last 24 hours. But please do get in touch with us if you have any questions, any more questions, or you'd like to follow up with us. I think we're signing off.
Bye. Thank you, everyone.